Marriage requires trust not only in our partner, but in ourselves, the wedding officiator tells the couple. Helen is carried away by the wedding officiator's voice. She stares dreamily at the couple, for whom she supplied bouquets for their wedding ceremony, and can feel the love they both share. In times like this, which is always, as her business has to do with the expression of emotions, especially love through flowers, she wishes she had a partner with whom she could share all the love in her heart. She's hopeful one day her path will cross with her Prince Charming, who will sweep her off her feet and show her the world. She comes back to reality and heads to the flower shop, where she works with her Aunt Carol. As she enters the shop, Aunt Carol, with whom she has worked since she graduated college as a botanist years ago, and is like a mother figure to her, asks her if she stayed back for their client's wedding. Helen smiles as she tells her that weddings are beautiful. Her aunt has 3 more orders for winter bouquets. Helen stretches forth her hand to take the order slip, as Aunt Carol asks suggestively if there were any eligible handsome groomsmen at the wedding she attended. Helen smiles shyly as she says no. This scene shows Helen at the shop arranging a bouquet she has spent months inventing by crossbreeding. The result is breathtaking, as the new rose flower breeds look better than she anticipated. As she arranges them in a vase, Henry, her best friend from college, walks in, teasing her about the lopsided arrangement of the flowers. Henry drops an invite on the table, and Helen picks it up, realizing it's an invite to the International Flower Selection Competition. Henry explains that it's an entry form, and he picked it up for her. She is surprised and thankful, but tells him she doesn't have a flower to enter. But of course, she does, the mystery rose flower she has been breeding for years. He insists that this species is the best she has ever created. Helen, feeling touched, admits that she doesn't think she's ready this year. Henry smiles, expecting her reluctance. He reveals that he has already submitted a sample of her flower for the competition. He asks her to give her special flower a name, in order to be eligible to compete. Later that evening, Helen is alone arranging a bouquet, when her assistant Beth, whom she recently employed, enters the room with Aunt Carol. Aunt Carol has been talking to Henry about Helen's hesitation in naming her special rose. She inquires why Helen is taking so long to come up with a name, reminding her that it usually doesn't take her more than a day or 2 to name each flower. Helen's assistant is intrigued about the competition, and Helen explains that it's a prestigious event where only the best hybrid flowers in the world are considered. She adds that people spend their entire lives working to create a rose worthy of being selected. The next day, Helen arrives at the flower shop to find Henry eagerly awaiting her. With a warm smile, he hands her a beautifully adorned card, sparking her curiosity. Curiously, she asks him about its contents. Henry reveals that it's an invitation to the highly prestigious Brooklyn Metropolitan Art Gallery's annual Black and White Gala, hosted this year amidst the breathtaking botanical gardens. Adding to the excitement, he mentions that he's been invited to share his vast knowledge of plants and flowers, answering any questions from attendees. Helen's interest is piqued, although she realizes the timing is tight, as she needs to find a dress by the evening. Entering the shop, Helen excitedly shares the news with Aunt Carol and their diligent assistant. Both of them are taken aback, knowing that such invitations are typically reserved for the elite of society. Aunt Carol insists that Helen must attend the gala, and assures her they will find the perfect dress in no time. Helen explains her relationship with Henry to her assistant. She reveals Henry has been her best friend since their college days. Although he moved back to Montana after graduation, fate brought them together again a few years ago when he secured a job at the Botanical Garden. Their friendship has remained steadfast ever since. Helen is able to get a beautiful ball gown with the help of her assistant. As she enters the venue of the masquerade ball, she is amazed at how breathtakingly beautiful the sight is. She's transported to the realm of a fairy tale, as everything is exquisitely decorated, and all attendees dress beautifully, each with a mask on. She sights a young man in a mask, and thinking it's Henry, she runs to meet him. Almost short of breath, she tells him there are so many people here that she had thought she wouldn't find him. She doesn't get a response though. She presses him, but when the man speaks, she realizes he is not Henry, but a total stranger. Embarrassed, she turns and leaves, luckily spotting the actual Henry, who admires her dress and compliments her beauty. Henry and Helen share a toast. Henry then requests that she dance with him, to which she smiles and playfully asks him to promise not to step on her toes. Just as they begin to sway to the music, Mr. Carlyle, a colleague of Henry's, interrupts them and requests a moment of Henry's time. Henry apologizes to Helen and walks away with his colleague to meet a potential investor who needs some clarifications. Meanwhile, Helen decides to visit the studio hosting the flower paintings exhibition. She admires each painting up for bid, carefully studying their details. As she contemplates bidding on a particular painting that has captured her attention, she hears a melodic male voice from behind. She turns around and realizes it's the intriguing stranger she encountered earlier. He playfully advises her not to run away again, as his ego wouldn't be able to handle it. Smiling, he encourages her to put in a bid for the painting. Helen hesitates, expressing doubt about the competitiveness of her bid, but he insists that she give it a try. Encouraged by his words, she places her bid. At that moment, Helen shares with him that her mother owned a painting similar to this 1 year ago, adding a personal connection to this particular painting. She reveals that her mother was an artist who toured around the world. Unfortunately, she lost her mom at the age of 10. Helen says it's embarrassing she is spilling out her heart to a stranger, and he reassures her, claiming that he doesn't have to be a stranger. She admires the unique flower in his chest pocket. He asks her to show him some of her favorite flower species. She hesitates for a moment before leading him up to the flower garden. She tells him her dad, who is a Navy officer, always sent flowers to her mom. Her mom kept a copy of those flowers in a book and explained their meaning to her. Every flower has a language and an emotion it conveys. She continues explaining the meanings of each flower. Lavender symbolizes love at first sight. He asks for her name, but she prefers to remain anonymous. They both walk back to the exhibition gallery. Helen notices an elderly person has bid more than her, and she can't let that happen, so she goes back and increases her bid. The elderly woman sees her and prepares to change her bid, but the stranger with Helen distracts her until the organizer takes the bidding sheet away. Helen appreciates his quick help. Helen's excitement fills her as she wins the bid. The stranger tells her that owning the painting deserves a celebratory dance. He asks her if she would like to dance with him. She nods eagerly. As they sway across the floor, he reveals that despite his initial reluctance to attend the event, meeting her has made it all worthwhile. Suddenly, a young man taps him on the shoulder, signaling that it's time to leave. He apologizes to Helen and swiftly departs before she can ask for his name, dropping his boutonniere. Helen picks up the fallen flower, her curiosity piqued. The species is from her flower shop. Just then, Henry taps her on the shoulder. As she turns around to face him, he asks where she has been, having searched for her everywhere. He apologizes for leaving her alone. With a smile, Helen informs him that she hasn't been by herself. She tells him of her encounter with the charming young man, describing their walk through the gardens and the art exhibition. Henry watches how she smiles, sure the stranger must have made a great impression on her. Helen admits to this, but is sure she'll never meet him again. She doesn't even know his name. She goes over to the exhibition hall to pick up the painting, but she's informed that unfortunately, someone else outbid her. This breaks her heart. She dejectedly calls it a night, and Henry sees her off to her apartment. It has been days since the masked ball gala, and she constantly still thinks of this stranger who has stolen her heart. Today, at the shop, she is talking to Beth about him. Her assistant assures her that there may still be hope. Helen mentioned earlier that he was wearing a unique boutonniere, one he got from the shop. They decide to go through the names of orders for that particular boutonniere, named Mystery Rose, to find the person who made the order. They come across the name of the last person who made the purchase, Charles Bradfield. Since he is an invitee to the last gala, they both deduce Charles may be working at the Botanical Garden. Coincidentally, it's the same place Henry works. Beth encourages Helen to take a flower delivery to the venue. This will avail her of the opportunity to meet Charles. Helen arrives at the Botanical Garden after making the delivery to their client, but, unfortunately, does not see Charles. She decides to go meet Henry to help her in her search. As she comes into his office, Henry's surprised at first, but she informs him she needs his help to find Charles. Henry isn't sure if Charles works with his company, but he goes through the list anyway. Just then, Helen spots a man who looks like Charles. She runs to him, calling his name, but as the man turns to her, it becomes obvious that she was mistaken. As Henry sees Helen off to her car, he tells her not to lose hope, and that there are other ways to search for her mystery man. She tells him her job helps connect people and helps them express their feelings. She always wished to have a fairy tale love story, but maybe it isn't meant to be. Henry feels sad, hearing her say this, and wishes he could help her. Later that evening, at the shop, Aunt Carol tells Helen she heard from Beth that she went in search of a mystery man. Aunt Carol asks her about Henry. She's in search of a stranger, but the perfect man is right there. Helen replies that Henry is her best friend, and she isn't sure he has any sort of romantic feelings towards her. On the following day, Henry visits a coffee shop to order his usual coffee. Suddenly, he spots a man bearing a striking resemblance to Charles, whom he saw when he Googled his name earlier. Intrigued, he approaches the man and inquires if he is Charles Bradfield. The man confirms his identity, and Henry introduces himself, expressing his desire to introduce Charles to a friend. Meanwhile, Helen reflects upon her recent conversation with Aunt Carol regarding the possibility of pursuing a romantic relationship with Henry. She admires Henry's qualities, values, and principles, and if given the chance, she would be interested in dating him. However, she remains uncertain about Henry's feelings towards her, whether he perceives her solely as a platonic companion. Determined to find clarity, she decides to visit him and engage in a heartfelt conversation. Upon arriving at Henry's office, he is happy to see her. He informs her that he has something important to share. Helen also tells him of her intention to discuss a matter with him, but she kindly requests him to speak first and reveal what he has on his mind. With eagerness, Henry reveals that he has located Charles, and urges Helen to meet him as soon as possible. The date between Helen and Charles is everything she imagined it would be. Charles is happy to see her. He even confesses that he went back to the dance hall to search for her. She has been on his mind since the ball, and he's happy she feels the same. He comforts her over losing her bid for the picture, as he knows how much she wanted to own that copy. Helen is simply happy she took his advice and gave it a chance. After the date, Helen can't stop gushing about Charles. She recounts to Henry that he almost seems perfect. He's a busy lawyer who has traveled to many countries and is also well-read. She tells Henry she will do him any favor he asks of her, since he was her hero in helping her search for Charles. Henry smiles sadly, hiding his true feelings, and says the only thing he wants is for her to name her rose and complete her submission for entry into the competition. Back at the shop, Helen fills up the questionnaire for entry into the competition. However, as she gets to the section where she has to name her crossbred rose flower, she struggles to come up with a decent name. Contemplating different options, Beth walks in and asks how her date with Charles went, and if they have plans to see each other again. Helen responds that it went well, but Charles didn't ask her out for another date. Beth urges her to call Charles and set up a date herself. Helen decides to give it a try. Unbeknownst to her, Charles met Henry at a restaurant, and the two are exchanging greetings. Charles thanks Henry for setting up the date when Helen's call comes in. Charles announces this to Henry, who suddenly becomes interested in the call. Helen asks Charles over the phone if he would be interested in having a dinner date with her that night. Charles suggests a restaurant, but Henry signals him against it and whispers Helen's favorite restaurant, Yellow Star Bistro. Charles quickly changes his mind and asks if she would prefer Yellow Star Bistro instead. He can hear her excitement in the positive reply. He also takes Henry's other suggestions of places they could visit. Unknowns to Helen, she wonders how Charles knows all these places she loves. The day after the dinner between Charles and Helen, Henry goes to visit Helen at the shop. As soon as Helen sees him, she happily informs him that she is done with the application and has sent in her entry request. Henry is excited to hear this and asks what she named her flower. She tells him she named it the Crystal Valentine Rose. Since it's Valentine's week, she asks him what he's doing for it. He responds that he will probably be doing some work, so she invites him to a dinner she's hosting for everyone, including Charles. She would love for Charles to meet Aunt Carol. She mentions that things have been amazing this past week, and that Charles has been doing things she loves as if he's known her forever. She still has no idea that Henry is the mastermind behind everything, and he doesn't say a word, swallowing his own feelings and trying to be a good friend. Before dinner, Charles and Henry meet up. Henry gives Charles a collection of poems and mini-books to gift to Helen for pre-Valentine. Charles is thankful for the heads up. At the dinner, they all get to know each other: Beth, Aunt Carol, Henry, Charles, and Helen. They are having a good time, but Henry has something he wants to discuss with Helen. He has always had feelings for her, but he is unsure if Helen would want to explore a romantic relationship with him. He's been turning it over in his mind and has decided he wants to discuss this with her and allow her to make her choice between himself and Charles. He wants to at least give it a chance before he loses the opportunity forever. Helen leaves for the kitchen and he follows, intending to speak to her. However, things don't go Henry's way. Just as he's about to spill the beans and shoot his shot, Beth bursts into the kitchen, grinning widely. She proceeds to hug Helen, telling her she's lucky to have Charles, as he is so charming, handsome, and a big catch. Hearing this, and seeing Helen's enthusiastic response, Henry loses his courage and decides against speaking about his feelings. The night ends well, and Helen walks Charles to the door. He gives her the little book of poems he previously collected from Henry. He tells her he got it from the bookstore, and he knew she would enjoy reading it. Helen is impressed by this gesture. Beth has harbored a crush on Henry ever since she laid eyes on him at the flower shop. Coincidentally, she runs into him while at a restaurant during lunch. Henry informs her that he's supposed to be having lunch with Helen, but he has a suspicion she will be late. Beth seizes the opportunity to mention that she knows about their long-standing friendship and has heard plenty about him. Confirming her knowledge, Henry explains that they have been friends since college, and they reconnected after he moved back to New York. As their conversation deepens, Henry confides in Beth about the challenging period he went through before reconnecting with Helen. Freshly divorced and uprooted to a new city, he found himself amid chaos. Even his job at the botanical garden, initially taken without much thought, quickly became regrettable. However, fate intervened when Helen, someone he hadn't seen since college, walked into his workplace to deliver a bouquet. At that very moment, he felt a profound sense of certainty that he had made the right choice. Suddenly, Beth realizes Henry is head over heels in love with Helen, and candidly asks him about it. Caught off guard, he appears stunned. She prompts him, asking how long he has felt this way. After a brief pause, perhaps relieved to finally be speaking about it to someone, Henry admits that it has been a while, but he never acted upon it due to the constantly unfavorable circumstances. Perplexed, Beth questions why he encouraged her to spend time with Charles, knowing his sentiments. Henry explains that his priority was her happiness, and Charles seemed to bring her joy. Empathetic to his situation, Beth encourages Henry to take a leap of faith and pursue Helen if his love for her is genuine. In the next scene, Charles and Helen take a walk. Charles receives a call. He is brokering a deal for his client to purchase the botanical garden. Helen is surprised to hear this, because that's where Henry works, and he never told her it's for sale. She asks Charles why his client would want to buy it, and he responds that it's a great location, and his client intends to build luxury apartments there. This alarms Helen, and she asks if the client wants to replace the botanical garden with condos. Charles is surprised that she isn't aware that the botanical garden is in a lot of debt and has become unmanageable, which is why they are looking to sell it. He thought Henry had told her, considering how close they are. Helen is furious. She storms into Henry's office and asks him when he intended to tell her that they are selling the botanical garden and turning it into a cheap estate. Henry replies that the garden is truly in financial trouble, and he has tried everything to help. He explains that his purpose of attending the gala was to try to impress a potential investor, Andrew Gray, but he bailed out on them. Helen asks Henry what he will do, since it could cost him his job. It turns out Henry has received another job offer, a research position to head a team, but he has to move to Arizona. He's already accepted, and will be starting next week, knowing there's no longer a reason for him to stay around. At that moment, Helen realizes she's in love with Henry. She can't bear the thought of him not being there, but more importantly, in the wake of this sudden circumstance, she doesn't dare to fully open up to him and tell him how she truly feels. When he finally comes around to say goodbye, both are sad, wishing they could say exactly how they feel, unknown to each other. It's Valentine's Day, and Helen is at the flower shop with Aunt Carol, who encourages her to cheer up. As they speak, Beth comes in with a package from the delivery company for Helen. As Helen unwraps the parcel, she is stunned to see that it's the particular painting she lost the bid on. She is beyond excited. Later that day, she is at a wedding venue prepping flowers for the bride and the hall decorations, when Helen sees Charles approaching her. With happiness radiating from her smile, she thanks him for the gift of the painting. But he looks taken aback and surprised, as he tells her he isn't the one who sent the painting. At the wedding venue, Helen realizes that the bride's grandfather is Andrew Gray, the same man Henry told her about, the potential investor at the botanical garden. She decides to take a risk and talk him into reconsidering investing in the botanical garden project, as saving the garden would do a lot of good for the community. She approaches the man and gets into a conversation with him. He has previously ordered a beautiful bouquet from their shop for his wife. She brings up the issue of him reconsidering investing in the garden, as if he doesn't, the garden will be converted into an estate. Andrew Gray assures her that he will give it more thought. Charles, who is bidding for the garden for his client, isn't pleased by Helen's sabotage of his plans. He tells her that either outcome from this won't be favorable for their relationship, and based on the conflict, they both decide to part ways. Helen decides at that point to speak to Henry and confess her feelings. She realizes he's the one who gifted her the painting. She calls him, and he informs her that he's at the airport about to board the plane. Panicking, she begs him not to leave, professing that she's in love with him, but his response isn't favorable. That night, brooding over the event that happened hours ago, she thinks it's one of her worst Valentine's days ever. Somehow, she lost two men in one day, and now the man she truly loves is on a plane heading far beyond her reach. Aunt Carol is comforting her. Unknown to her, though, Henry is back and ready to tell her how he has always felt. And this time, he's going to take it a notch further by proposing to her. He had earlier explained all of this to Aunt Carol, and now the plan is in motion. Aunt Carol cleverly asks Helen to deliver Valentine's flowers to the botanical garden, knowing that Henry is there. Overwhelmed by the surprise, and full of joy at his heartfelt confession, Helen says yes to being Henry's wife. She knows she's in love with him, and that's all that matters.